Back, and we are joined by the great Sam Faddis, a former CIA undercover operative turned one of the great analysts of momentous developments in our country. And you can follow his work at andmagazine.com and Substack. Sam, I talked a moment ago about not just the threat from China in the abstract and the help that they're getting from Joe Biden, but about one particular example of this, and that is in the pandemic environment, the so-called CCP virus, the Chinese Communist Party virus that was unleashed upon us back in 2019 and the rest of the world, of course. We have seen a number of steps taken that have greatly diminished our freedoms, and I would argue our security. And we now have evidence that the State Department was sufficiently confident very early on in this crisis that the source of it was, in fact, a laboratory that is part of the Chinese illegal biological warfare program. Connect some dots here for us as to what the implications of that are and what is seemingly flowing from it in terms of sort of the imposition of the China model, as they call it here.
Well, the State Department, I think what you're making reference to is that there's a memo that has surfaced, I think, literally within the last few days. And it dates back to, I believe, April 2020. And it's a State Department internal memo. And they're talking about where this thing come from. And they go through they identify like 5 possibilities. And they go through it and very succinctly conclude that the most logical common sense explanation, based on all the data we have, is that this thing came out of the Wuhan lab.
All the data we had back in April of 2020, no less.
This is an April 2020 memo. They've already analyzed all this information, and that's what they're saying. And they're also very clear that the Chinese are preventing anybody from getting to the bottom of it.
And this raises the question, Sam, when we're talking about that, there was Avril Haines, the director of national intelligence, pushed out an intelligence assessment that said, we just can't really figure this out. That was late last year, as I recall. So how do we square what they knew back in April of 2020 and what they said to the American people in the fall of 2021?
Well, of course, the memo, it didn't occur in isolation. I mean, we don't have time to go through everything, but the memo is completely consistent with what the Department of State reporting had actually been showing even before the pandemic, that the Wuhan lab was a disaster waiting to happen. In fact, they specifically had said like 2 years earlier, we could have a pandemic originating here. So there's no explanation really as a matter of common sense other than the assessment was cooked, right? They didn't produce what the intelligence community is supposed to produce, which is an objective, as best we can determine, analysis without who cares what the politics are. That's not the job of the IC. They, just like they did in Benghazi, they produced a cooked analysis that suited the political purposes of the Biden administration.
Cooking the books is something that unfortunately is not unique to this administration, but to the extent that it does benefit the Chinese Communist Party, it is a particular concern. Sam, let me ask you to work us through a complex problem. You've spent during your distinguished undercover career a fair amount of time in a country called Pakistan in support of our efforts to secure Afghanistan against the Taliban, which was operating from safe havens there. We've learned recently that the Taliban in Pakistan is now swearing fealty to the Taliban in Afghanistan and going for the overthrow of the Pakistani government. I'm interested in, as a thought experiment with you, where does China come out in all of this? Pakistan is their ally, very important ally. The Taliban is their new friend. Are they rooting for the Taliban to overthrow the Pakistani government and presumably usher in a new, more, even if it's possible, jihadist government there in Islamabad? Or are they going to be helping the Pakistani government hold the line against their new friends?
Well, look, I think they're going to try to straddle all of this. And in the short term, what they're looking for is to loot Afghanistan of minerals and everything else that they can get out of it. This is the Chinese are very hard nosed on this. What's in it for us? We're not, ideology is
But
irrelevant here.
interests are interests, and I would assume that they do have an interest in maintaining the government of Pakistan as a reliable ally, especially with all those nuclear weapons scattered about the country. No,
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the wild card in all of this, I mean, the Pakistanis have played a double game with us, right? They've been in bed with the Taliban for years. The wild card in all of this is the sort of fire of jihad, if I can use that. Is the Taliban in Kabul and now their formal allies in Pakistan have their own ideas about how this is supposed to end, and that's a worldwide caliphate. So you can kind of play with them for a while and think you can control it. And after a while, I think you find out, like the Saudis did the hard way, that you look down and the ground
yeah.
under your feet is on
Well, especially
fire,
at a time
right?
when you are in a genocidal campaign against their co-religionists in Western China. It
Absolutely.
does seem to me,
Yes.
though, that they're intent on making common cause with people who may have a different end game in mind, whether it's the jihadists or whether it's the global capitalists.
Mhm.
Confident, I guess, as the Chinese are, that
Right.
they'll prevail in the end. The other guys seem to think they won't, but we'll
Right.
see. The main point is, in the meantime, they're all coming for us. And doing so, I think, rather more together than is safe for us.
Absolutely.
Lastly, let me ask you quickly, if I can, Sam, to talk a little bit about this deal with Iran. You've spent a lot of time focused on weapons of mass destruction
Hmm.
and terrorism. That, in fact, was your last duty station at the CIA. Um, we're
Hmm.
seeing even some Democrats now turning up and saying, this deal that the Biden administration is desperately trying to cut with the mullahs in Iran is so bad, is so reckless, is so irresponsible that even we can't go along with it. Talk a little bit about that and where you think this is headed.
Well, it's a disaster, and I hope it's heading to. I hope it's going to crash and burn. But it's a surrender document. We're getting ready to remove sanctions, hand billions of dollars to the Iranians. We're getting ready. We're attempting to craft a deal which will make the IRGC arguably the most powerful terrorist organization on the planet, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, to
Well,
remove
they won't be a terrorist
sanctions, and
organization anymore. One of the things, apparently they'll be taken off the
it will
terrorism
not be.
list, for heaven's sakes. So it's just powerful
That's exactly right.
and dangerous, needless to say. And to the extent that this is teeing up to be all of the things that you just said, how important is it that it be opposed and if, as you say, possible, crashed and burned, if not before it's signed, afterwards?
Look, if we go through with this deal in any semblance of the form that it's being crafted, the Iranians are going to set the Middle East on fire again, and it's going to be worse than it ever was. And the Israelis are undoubtedly going to take offensive action. So you're not just talking about terrorist action, you're talking about a war in the Middle East. I will not be surprised to find the Saudis arm themselves with nuclear weapons if you go forward. Everything that Donald Trump did with the Abraham Accords to try to finally bring peace to the Middle East,
Yeah.
completely undone
Well,
and
and
worse
not
than it ever
least,
was.
almost certainly a war with Israel, and that may be a nuclear war. Who knows? Sam Faddis, not cheerful tidings, but the hard truth, and it's what we expect of you, and we appreciate so much your bringing it to bear, not only here on Securing America with regularity, but of course through your other platforms. It's vital that your voice be heard, and we're so appreciative that you take the time to do it with us. Godspeed, my friend. Keep up the great work that you do. I look forward next to talking with Jonathan Emord about the true prospects for democracy in our nation, whether tyranny is actually the agenda. A lot of people who are blathering on about it at the moment. That and more straight ahead.